Many modern philosophers regard the philosophy of the Middle Ages as unworthy of any serious study for a variety of reasons. And they go on here. Some will say that it was so subordinated to theology that the two were practically indistinguishable. And so it was basically wordplay, or what they call logic chomping, quote unquote. What is your response to such an assertion?
Well, I think, the philosophy of the Middle Ages was not in all respects subordinated to theology. In many respects, it was a part of theology, but reason was given its own due. And St. Thomas Aquinas, who's probably the best representative of medieval philosophy, but not just St. Thomas Aquinas, certainly St. Augustine was concerned with getting logical and reasonable evidence for not only God, but for the soul. And the proofs that they formulated for God and the soul certainly represent not an appeal to theology in any way, not an appeal to reveal truth in any way, because they viewed reason as having the capacity to arrive at truth. And of course, St. Thomas Aquinas said, look, you get truths that you get from reason and truths that you get from revelation. They have to be consistent with one another because they came from the same source. But nevertheless, St. Thomas and St. Augustine certainly don't depend on revelation to get answers to the questions for the existence of God and for the existence of the soul. Now, some people might say, well, those 5 ways in the Summa Theologica are just simply, too perfunctory. They just don't do the trick. They leave so many things unanswered. I mean, basically, the first 2 ways are just, an uncaused cause argument. That's true. They are simply an uncaused. They basically get to the point where you need at least one uncaused cause. But you also have to read the rest of the Summa, or read, the De Potentia Dei, which is, the Questiones Disputate de Veritate, or De Potentia Dei. These are really incredibly good works. But anyway, if you just go on and read in the Summa, those 5 ways are explained in other questions that are answered. Well, why does God have to be one? Why is it that God has to be an act of understanding? Why is it that God has to be absolutely simple, and so forth? And of course, you get the critique, for example, of Richard Dawkins, and he critiques Thomas's 5 ways, but it's clear he hasn't read a word past that. And so, of course, Thomas has no chance of explaining the other part of the proof. And of course, Dawkins has never disproved why there has to be at least one uncaused cause. That proof still goes back not just to Thomas Aquinas, not just back to Augustine, but back to Aristotle himself and his Physics and Metaphysics. A completely pagan philosopher, which Thomas premised his works on. And by the way, no one has disproved that proof of at least one uncaused cause. And Thomas goes on to specify the other dimensions later on in the Summa. And of course, anybody who gives St. Thomas Aquinas a fair shake will conclude that he did it by use of the reason and not by an appeal to Scripture or an appeal to revelation.
And that's a Jesuit promoting a Dominican, so that's a good thing there at the same time.
That's right.
The other thing I was going to ask you, it strikes me that a lot of times when we deal with these kind of Middle Age things, it's, the Dark Ages get thrown out, how many angels are dancing on the head of a pin. It was an attempt to kind of show that prior to the Enlightenment, we didn't really know what was going on. Isn't that really just an attack on the Church?
Yes, it was an attack on the Church, but it was also, an attack on a whole way of doing philosophy. And so, of course, everybody wanted a new starting point. St. Thomas Aquinas, of course, was had an empirical starting point. But, some people wanted a radically empirical one. And of course, we also see the rationalists, really in many ways are very close to Platonic philosophy, right? To Plato's philosophy. And poor Descartes, has to prove the existence of God in order to get back to the sensory world. And of course, he does this by a logical proof. He's a mathematician. This is how he operates. This is what he does. So, I think those kinds of things, though, were not a replacement. I think there many of the proofs for God that come from the modern period, and certainly like Lonergan's proof for God in chapter 19 of Insight, a recent proof, those things are done, they're commensurate with the kind of work that Thomas was doing. Yes, they're put into modern logical format. Yes, they're including, the critiques of epistemology from Immanuel Kant and others. Yes, they have a more modern terminology, than the medieval terminology. But they have to do that in order to bring the essence of St. Thomas's thought into the contemporary world. But at the end of the day, Thomas was not on the wrong track. I mean, this guy was unbelievably brilliant. And anybody who attempts to make a straw man out of him really does not do him justice.
Well, Father, let me ask you.
I just leave it at that.
Right. Also, just before we go to our next email, don't you think also there tends to be this pride of modernity that says, people in the past really weren't that smart. So how could they know more than we know? How could they have greater insights than we have? There's a little bit of a bias there, I think, is there too.
Yeah, well, people in the past were not that smart. I guess we have to throw out Archimedes and Euclid and Plato and Pythagoras and Zeno and Aristotle and Socrates, along with, of course, St. Augustine, St. Bonaventure, St. Thomas Aquinas, Albertus Magnus. I mean, these guys were incredible geniuses. And of course, if you threw them all out, where would the moderns begin? I mean, they're of course building on the legacy of these ages. Galileo just didn't go up into the tower one day and throw down a couple of lead balls and discover the laws of acceleration without, of course, having this huge intellectual background that enabled him to conclude to the laws of falling bodies. Now, if you want a great work on this, you might just take a look at William Wallace's book called Galileo and His Sources. Really excellent book that's been written. I think it came out from Oxford University Press. It might have been Cambridge. But anyway, it's a very, very fine book. I think people need to read this because then you'll see, well, where did this... Galileo wasn't born in a vacuum.
Right.
In fact, he was working with the Jesuits at the Roman College. So, of course, the same thing holds true for Newton. And by the way, Newton, at the tender young age of early 30s, gave up physics after writing the Principium Mathematicum, right? The basic laws of physics. He gives it all up to do what? Study Scripture and theological revelation because he sees God in his findings. Right. Now, of course, this guy is not in an intellectual vacuum any more than Galileo was. For all intents and purposes, of course, these were not the Dark Ages. They were incredibly enlightened ages. They gave rise to an intellectual foundation that allowed science to actually come into being. And there's a reason, by the way, that science came into being in Western culture and not in other cultures. Why empirical science had its due in the West and out of Western universities rather than in other cultures through other religions. And that's because of the great medieval synthesis, which, by the way, for whatever reason, these historical revisionists refuse to recognize. But anybody, I mean, there's a wonderful book out, on the history of science and scientific sources that's also, just excellent, which can explain all of these things. Right. That's going on in the West.
And we've had
by
programs
the way, it's by Stanley Yaki.
Okay, Stanley Yaki was a fantastic scholar.
Stanley Yaki.
Yeah, Upon This Rock was one of my favorite books he wrote about the Pope. Upon This Rock, that was great.